Wow, this has been what feels like such a long time since I had an opportunity to come on here live, be able to chat with some of y'all, and obviously be able to be a servant and provide some value. Thank you so much for sticking around with me, for having patience with me. The last couple of weeks have just been absolutely hectic. Dealing with things that come up, being a father, being a business owner, also taking the opportunity to go to the motherland and visit some families, and obviously be able to come back and share all the lessons that I've been able to learn while I've been away. So, if you guys don't know, or if this is your first time here, welcome back. My name is Will Zapata. Basically, I've been helping families over the last 10 years understand, convert, and use solar in order to create more independence, to empower themselves, and to protect not just themselves, but the future generation from what I like to call just the inflation of life. So, thank you all so much for taking the time to be with me. If you're sharing or you're watching this live, please make sure to leave a comment. Definitely join us. At the end of the day, this Beyond the Solar series is here to help all of us as individuals realize what our true potential is, what was our given talent by the Creator, and then obviously how we can empower ourselves to be the best version of who we are and be able to create an impact to the rest of society. So, if you don't know, I am originally from the Dominican Republic. I emigrated to the United States when I was, about a year and a half. I do say that I am more American than the red, white, and blue. I love this country, but I also love to take the opportunity to learn from the lessons of where my parents have came from, just some of the things that we have gone through, and obviously why I am the way that I am. That all comes from my experiences, my life, and the people that matter to me most. And nobody probably encompasses that more than my grandfather. I took a ton of lessons, not just on my most recent trip, but every single time I've had an opportunity to speak with my grandfather, or I look back at the interactions that we've had, I realized that even though my grandfather was or is somebody that we might call, hey, somebody that lived in the old country, somebody that was not rich materialistically wise or material wise, he's still somebody that imparted a great deal of lessons on me. If it wasn't for my grandfather, I don't think I would be the man that I am today. And I think that there are some fundamental lessons that I've been able to learn from my grandfather that would also be helpful as we're going through and navigating life, right? So basically, just to kind of give you a little background and to dive right into it, my grandfather, who is 89 years old right now, he grew up in the Dominican Republic. My grandfather did not come from people of means. When I spoke to my grandfather recently, he grew up in a house that was basically the floor was all dirt. If you've ever been to the Dominican Republic or some of the Caribbean islands, you know that when it rains or it gets flooded, that can be a huge mess. My grandfather didn't grow up with a formal education. He grew up since what he can remember being 2 years old, basically raising chickens and using nature, using his environment in order to create a living. With that being said, my grandfather did have 7 children, 6 of them which survived. He has also, for the most part, been in a relationship with my grandmother for their entire lives. The only thing that separated my grandmother and grandfather was that my grandmother was called on to do, some work in the spiritual realm. She was called by the Creator to go be one of their servants, and that's really been the only thing that separated my grandmother and my grandfather from being together. So with that, I was able to learn so many things from my grandfather. Most importantly, how to be a man, how to face resilience, how to focus on the things that truly matter, and just be able to navigate life the best way that we can. So going right into it, right? The first lesson is, understanding hardship. My grandfather, growing up dirt poor, really taught me a lot about being able to be thankful for the things that you do have. And what I mean by dirt poor is I'm literally taking that, like I said earlier, my grandfather, like the floor, which in their home, it was literally made out of dirt. It wasn't until my mother, many years later, was able to emigrate into the United States. And what we do whenever we are a family of immigrants, usually the first generation is there to help out, siblings, parents, send the money back, be able to just do what we can to provide a better life for the family that is back home. And being able to learn from my grandfather, just how to be resilient, how to make do with what he had is super thoughtful, right? My grandfather has always been somebody that he's been very focused on family. My grandfather has been somebody that has been able to use the environment around him. I remember hearing stories from my mother, and she would tell me that, and when she was growing up, they didn't have a lot of the things that we have. And I can go on a ton of lists, but starting off with the most important one, that they not have electricity. I still remember going to the Dominican Republic to where my grandfather is from. We call it El Campo, right? Basically the countryside. And I still remember there was no running water, there was no electricity. Basically, the way that you would light things up is you would use a gas lamp. The way that we would get water, if we would have to walk, what felt like forever in order to get water at a well. But it was things that probably, at least me living in the United States, I definitely take for granted. Having access to hot water, having access to drinking water, right? Let alone just having access to water that can help you cook and things of that nature. Those were really luxuries when my grandfather was growing up, right? And, those are things that, again, for now, we probably take for granted. But it always, whenever I want to complain about something, or whenever I want to, play the victim or think that life is so hard, I always go back to the things that my grandfather had to go through. I go back to the things that he didn't have. I go back to the way that he lived his life. And fundamentally, right, I could sit here and say maybe my grandfather had a harder life, which I think that he did. I want to make that clear about how blessed I know that I am living in today's day and age, having access to the internet, having access to good food, which in America nowadays does feel questionable, having access to clean water, all these things, right? Having access to quick things. Those are things that, literally at the age of 89 right now, my grandfather is just starting to discover, right? I think electricity started to hit, where my grandfather was from, probably like 10 to 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. But by that point, my grandfather was accustomed to not growing up with electricity, having access to power or things of that nature, right? The other thing that my grandfather taught me really, really well is how to stretch a dollar, or in his case, how to stretch a peso. So one of the things that I did as soon as I was able to is that I would send money back to my grandfather. I send it to my grandmother. That way they can, one, just be able to have money on what they want. They did not have like large needs, right? My grandmother would be happy as long as she had some, rice and beans to eat. And as long as she had something to eat, she was totally fine. She didn't need anything else. I remember my mom telling me that she had to literally fight with my grandmother just to be able to have her accept a new bed, because my grandmother was okay with essentially what the bare minimum was, but as long as she had something to eat, that's what made her happy. And it just made me think about, what kind of hardships, what kind of things did they have to go through in order for them to be happy with such simple things, right? It really makes me take a look at myself and realize, one, how ungrateful I can be, being 100% transparent, but it also makes me realize just how blessed I am when it comes to having all these amenities, living in a first world country, and then obviously making sure that I pass that on to the next generation and make sure that I can add more purpose to their own lives. I remember I had this question to my grandfather. I asked him, I said, hey, how are you so good with money? And basically, I remember that recently my grandfather owed somebody in his village some money, and he got dressed up, nothing crazy, but he put on shoes and he went to go pay them back. And I went on a walk with him and I asked him, like, hey, grandpa, how did you get good at money? And the response he gave me was hilarious, but he said, well, the reason why I got so good at money is because I never had it. Right, so my grandfather is really, really stingy with spending his money. Even right now, he hoards it. He likes to make sure to be as independent as he possibly can. And my grandfather, he doesn't see well nowadays. Age is catching up with him, but he still has the soul and the spirit of somebody that's probably 30 years younger. When we celebrated his 88th birthday last year, it was a great experience. He was around families, friends, and it was just awesome, and he was the life of the party. So definitely, looking at life and looking at things that might be going difficult, or might be difficult in your life, they really might be more tools to empower you, to make you stronger. I look at my grandfather as being one of the strongest men that I know, and it's just because of the way that he's been able to carry himself. Even through the situation where he's gone through loss, right? My grandfather is the last surviving member of his immediate family, which means like his brothers and sisters are no longer here. For the longest time, he lived next to his twin brother, right? Which at certain moments they had some difficulties, but for the most part, my uncle, or my great uncle, which is my grandfather's brother, is his twin, and he has been, moved on to the next portion of his life for a couple of years now. He lost his sister in a flood that happened on his in his village, and then the most recent loss was his wife, which is my grandmother. And that was probably one of the biggest lessons that I've gotten as to how to handle, losses, and look at how deep and how strong of a man my grandfather really is. I don't think I've ever seen my grandfather cry. I've never seen him complain about anything. If you speak to my grandfather has a ton of positive energy. He is a great person to be around. It's hard to understand what he says now, but if you can kind of lean in and listen closely, you can get a lot of great insight from him. And really, one of the things that made me realize, the pain of loss was when I lost my grandmother. I did not want to cry in front of anyone, right? For me, I saw other people crying, which is understandable of the situation, right? My grandmother, she was obviously a grandmother, a mother, auntie, a friend, a counselor. She was a lot of things to a lot of different people. And, her loss impacted our family directly in a hard way. But I was trying to do my best to stay strong and to not let anyone see me cry. And when I saw my grandfather break down into tears, I just asked myself, what kind of pain must my grandfather be going through that he broke down in tears, right? And it's the only time I've ever seen my grandfather cry. It's the only time that I've seen him really break down. And it just goes to show you, like the kind of relationship that him and my grandmother had. I asked him a lot of times, like, what were the things that him and my grandmother would argue about. And he told me that they never really would argue, right? They tried to stay as closely as possible. And really, the only thing that caused some rift was that, if you know about parents in the old days, my grandfather was a very tough disciplinary, right? So my grandfather, he believed in not sparing the rod, and my uncles got the worst of it. My mom, she was spared being like the only girl in her family, but those would be probably the only thing that my grandfather and my grandmother really fought about, right? My grandfather was somebody that he was a hard worker. My grandfather worked in the fields. In the Dominican Republic, you might hear that, hey, he would go to, they call it La Joya, where they're growing food, or, they would go and tend to the animals. My grandfather spent a lot of time, or most of his life, if not all of it, raising chickens. But my father showed up consistently, right? He was resilient. One of the things that I learned is that resilience isn't loud. My grandfather has never ever boasted about how hard he worked, or what he did for somebody. He just got up every single day, understood that that was expected of him, and he showed up every single day for his family. And, in an era where we're so accustomed to instant gratification, a lesson like that becomes so much more important because of the fact that, you know, we're so used to, we order something on Amazon, we want it right away. We order something on Grubhub, we get it right away, right? But I remember my mom telling me that back in the day, you had to wait until the coffee grounds was brought to you, and having coffee. And a lot of us now, we say America runs on Dunkin', but when my grandparents grew up, like, coffee was a luxury, right? Because it's not like, one, you had access to the coffee. Again, where my grandparents grew up, they didn't even have electricity in the last 20 years, right? My mom would tell me stories about, like, what they did for entertainment is that they would pay, like, what's probably equivalent to 5 cents now, but they would pay to go to the corner store and listen and sit around a radio, and that's how they got their entertainment, right? So I definitely want to take an opportunity to like reflect and just look at what challenges are you facing, right? That later has become a strength to you. I know for me, one of the things that was really, really hard for me was being able to get out of the security of having a regular job and going through, months and years of me either seeing very little income or no income at all and just relying on my savings really gave me the resilience that I needed to understand that as long as we can show up, as long as we have another day, we have another opportunity, that we can move forward and we can make something of our lives. And those are just lessons that I was able to learn from my grandfather, again, just based on how they were able to live, the kind of struggles that they had to go through, and at the end of the day, how happy they ended up being with their lives. The other thing that my grandfather taught me was living with a purpose. As I mentioned before, we don't come from money. We don't come from a line of smart business people. We don't come from, a line of people that inherited anything. One of the things that they actually would complain about my grandfather is that my grandfather was too simple. He as long as he had his family, as long as he had food, he would be okay, right? And to us, that is very a scary thought. I know for me that is extremely scary. However, looking at the way that my grandfather has lived his life, I've never heard my grandfather say he has any regrets. I think that my grandfather was abundantly rich because of the fact that he had people that loved him. He has people that care about him. He has people that are still around to help him. He raised a family. He had an amazing partner in my grandmother, right? And it's things that gave him purpose and gave him a dutiful life. When I was having my second child, my son, I asked my grandfather and I said, "Hey, what is some advice that you would give me?" Right? And this is him understanding that with my daughter's mother, I've gone through a lot of hardship, right? Which is a story for another day, for those of us that are looking to be fathers. But basically, one of the greatest advice that he gave me is he said, make sure that you make it work with the mother of your son. He said, you don't want to be around chasing women or seeking gratification from, what we call lustful things or things of the flesh. Focus on somebody that loves you when you're down, somebody that loves you when you're up, and somebody that loves you no matter what. And those are things that have been extremely helpful when it comes to navigating my relationship, navigating my duties with my children. I look at my grandfather as somebody that I can look to as an example of what to do in order to live a purposeful life, right? My grandfather was somebody that he had certain principles, right? He, one, was, a man of faith, which I think is awesome. A little bit different from me, a spiritual person, but completely understandable. He was a person that was honest, right? My grandfather, he told me this before he had his children. He was an avid drinker. My grandfather used to like to play with chickens or roosters. So basically, if you're from the Caribbean islands, right, we have this thing where they will make chickens kind of battle each other, right? Or roosters go against each other and you kind of bet on who's going to win. My grandfather was very heavy into that. And the moment that he had his children, he left all that behind, right? And the reason for it was because my grandfather did not want his children to see him as an example of somebody who was, going out sleeping with different women. He didn't want his children to see him drunk. He didn't want his children to see him gambling, or, he didn't want to impart any bad behaviors that could possibly be detrimental to his children. Now, did they all follow it? No, because we're all individuals, right? But at the end of the day, my uncles had a great example, and me, myself, and my grandfather, in seeing how a man is supposed to carry himself, right? How he put family first before anything, alongside his love of God, and then obviously, his love of his partner. So, just absolutely beautiful things that, again, right now they seem like they're the hardest thing to obtain, but for somebody like my grandfather, it was the most simple things in life that gave him purpose, right? My grandfather loved his chickens. I'll tell you a story about this. I mentioned that he lost his sister in a flood that happened in his village. Now, The reason why my grandfather is alive today is because my grandfather is stubborn, but he did not want to leave his chickens behind. He didn't want them to drown. He was forced by his children to go stay in my mother's house, which is in another part of the country in the Dominican Republic that was safer. But my grandfather may have not been here today if it was up to him, just because he did not want to leave his chickens. Unfortunately, his sister, she didn't want to leave her house, and she ended up unfortunately losing her life, right? But again, those are things that I think at the end of the day, right? Even my grandfather's sister lived a life with purpose. I know I personally had a chance to meet her. And anytime that you're able to live a life that's, you get into your elderly years, you have people around you that love and care about you, it is definitely a life worth living. Um, and then the last point, it would be on my grandfather really focused on the things that matter. I don't think that my grandfather ever thought about measuring his own level of success based on the material things that he had or that he owned. But I think it was by the fact that he was, or should I say, he determined his success based on the people that love him and who he was able to share their love. I jokingly say that I'm my grandfather's favorite grandchild, and I'm not saying this because I am on this live. You can ask my grandfather today. You can ask my mother, anybody of his siblings, and he'll tell you that I do have a deep connection with my grandfather. I did not understand what death really was until the passing of my grandmother. And even then, I still feel like I don't understand it. I feel like reality is going to hit me. It's hardest when my grandfather, does get called upon by the creator to start another portion of his journey and his existence, right? I think that, yeah, he'll have a physical death, maybe the body itself, but the spirit does live on. I still do my best to honor my grandmother. But I think that that's going to be a harsh reality that hits me, which I will say, admittedly, I don't know how prepared I am for it. I definitely hope that I can be as strong as my grandfather when the time does come that I do have to deal with him being called to, the other portion of his existence and, experiencing a physical death. So, but my grandfather, again, the way that he measured himself, it was by who loved him, how good his reputation was, the fact that he was able to raise successful children, right? The other thing is that I think that time, and money, I think that my grandfather looked again at what he had based on how much time he spent with his family. I Being 100% honest, I don't think my grandfather has ever given me, a dollar for me to go buy anything. Not that it matters, but my grandfather has always welcomed me with welcome arms. He's always been, someone to share food with me. Even in my most recent visit to him, it was an honor for me to be able to just sit down with him and share a meal, right? And my grandfather would be the first one to share a meal with him, which somebody that probably went through famine, probably went through eating or not eating so much, where meat was a luxury, food was a luxury for my parents growing up, him being able to share a meal with you is something that's so important. Side note, this is a story that I just thought about, is my grandfather was the kind of person and very prideful, is that my uncles would get in severe trouble if they ate at somebody else's house, right? Because in his time, if you ate at somebody else's house, it means that you were not being fed in your own home. And the things that my grandfather prided himself on is making sure that his family was taken care of and that they were well fed. So he didn't have a lot of that himself, but he made sure that his children at least had something to eat. So things that I just find so incredible, because as somebody that I struggle with trying to figure out my identity, I struggle with insecurities if I'm not being able to provide the way that I should. I look at somebody like my grandfather, and if he would have had even, a percentage of what I have today, he'd probably be the happiest man alive. I'm sure that he is, and that's without experiencing any of the great things or, any of the technological things. I think I said that wrong. Technological things that have improved my life, but my grandfather, I think, would still, not have any regrets, right? Looking at it at the perspective at 89, my grandfather taught me that it's not worth stressing over the little stuff. The little stuff or the little problems that we face day to day in the long stream, right? They're probably things that don't matter. I think that the happiest moment for my grandfather most recently has been the fact that, he was able to hold his great grandson. And I think for all of us, especially as young, young men, I think that that's what we should be looking for as our, barometer for what success is. It's so easy for us to think that success is having material things, or, living a life that we have to share for other people to watch, or getting validation from people that wouldn't even lend us a dollar. But I think that when I saw my grandfather hold my son, it was probably the happiest moment that I could have experienced. He started singing to him one song that I will not attempt to sing, but I do remember that those are the kind of songs that would be sung during his time, a very simple nursery rhyme that he would use, right? I think that my grandfather, again, if he had a chance to speak to all of us here, he would probably tell us to, focus on family, make sure that you're doing the right things for your children, and don't sweat the small stuff. Because in the long scheme of it, those things will not matter, right? We as men, we should look for finding purpose and being servants to our family. I think that that's why my grandfather has lived a very enriched and very purposeful life. It's because he dedicated himself to his family, to his wife, who was my grandmother, and to just being a great example for all of us, right? My grandfather is somebody that I will be talking to most likely until the end of my physical life, right? There's lessons that I have from my grandfather that I want to be able to impart on my children, especially my son, him being a young man. He's 8 months, but to me, I treat him like he's a grown man already. But those are things that I want to be able to pass down to him because they're worth more than any material thing that I can pass on. The biggest thing, and one of the biggest things, should I say, that I learned from my grandfather is that it's the intangibles that truly matter. I tend to stress myself out like, oh, am I going to leave my son a house? Is my daughter going to have, money saved? And I realize that those things really don't matter. What matters is, am I teaching them to be good people? Am I teaching them to be free thinkers? Am I teaching them how to navigate in an ever changing world? So I hope that you were able to look at this as something that can be helpful to you. I'd love to hear any stories that you've came across when it came to your grandparents or maybe even elderly people in your family. At the end of the day, I think the elderly have an immense amount of wisdom that they can share with us. They're not going to be here, for a long time. And then, most importantly, right, they've gone through struggles that we couldn't even imagine, right? Like going through struggles of not having food, not having water, not having electricity. It's hard for us to be able to understand what that is, but it's so great to be able to talk to our grandparents and really grasp what is the most important things in life. So thank you so much. I apologize for the hiatus, but I feel so good to be back. Stay tuned for more content coming your way. I hope that I was able to provide some value to y'all, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.